Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I have a very fun and beautiful card for you guys using this beautiful background stamp. Now this is the Sparkle Strands Stamp from the Sweet Wishes release by Simon's Stamp. The card that I created here is part of an Instagram hop that is happening right now. So do check my Instagram account for more details and prizes to be won during this hop. Before we take a look at this card, I would really appreciate if you could take a minute to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon so that you get notified every time I post a new video. Now here's the Sparkle Strand background stamp from this release. This is my absolute favorite background stamp and I've used it in a number of different projects. Now for our card today, I wanted to highlight more of this background. So for my sentiment, I kept it as my focal point and I'm using this fancy bold thanks sentiment again by Simon's Stamp. Now I will be doing an embossed resist technique here on this gorgeous background, and for that I'm using this beautiful blue trio of inks. This is the Ocean, Surf and Seafoam Positively Saturated ink pads. Now to get started, I have my A2 size panel mounted on my stamping tool and I will line that up along with the Sparkle Strands stamp set onto the stamping tool. I will be heat embossing this entire background on this panel. Now, do not forget to use your anti-static powder tool every time you heat emboss. Now, I'm using the Simon's Stamp Clear Embossing ink for this, and I like to emboss my panel twice. Now, since this is an entire card panel, the entire background, I decided to stamp it twice just to make sure that there is even coverage of that ink everywhere. I like to use this microfiber cloth or my sleeve to apply even pressure on the stamping tool so that the ink gets evenly distributed on the entire panel. Also make sure that you don't apply a lot of pressure when you're pressing onto these stamps because there are chances that the ink might get a little splotchy. Now I will carefully remove this panel and here I have my Simon's Stamp gold embossing powder which I will pour over this entire panel. Whenever I'm dusting any of that extra powder from the panel, I make sure that I'm tapping very gently just so that all of that powder remains stuck to that embossed lines. I like to place my panel on this Positively Everything tool before heat setting the embossing powder. Now since this is an entire background, I will make sure that I keep moving my heat gun throughout the panel and not just concentrating it over one place. This helps to prevent any warping of the paper. Also, since we are embossing on the entire background panel, I like to use a heavyweight cardstock. Here I'm using the 110-pound Nina Solar White cardstock. Now once my panel is done with all the heat embossing, I will leave it for a minute or so just for everything to cool down before I do any kind of ink blending. Now my absolute favorite right now is the Positively Perfect Craft Tacky Matte for any kind of ink blending. Now this mat here measures 8 1/4 by 6 1/4 inches and this is the perfect to hold your papers, your die cut pieces for any kind of stamping and ink blending. This mat also sticks into your misties. I like to have the acetate sheet placed on the back of this mat just so that I can move the mat around on my working surface. If you like to have the mat stay in place, you could remove that transparency sheet. Now we can begin with our ink blended. I like to use or get started with the lightest shade. So here I am using Seafoam, which is the lightest shade in this beautiful teal shades of ink. I love using my positively saturated inks. These are saturated dye inks with these raised surfaces and durable foam pads. Well, I've had these inks for almost a year now and I have not yet refilled them, and yet they are absolutely stunning and juicy enough to cover this entire panel. Well, here you see how beautiful that looks over the gold embossed image. Not just for ink blending, I also love to use these for watercoloring. Now, once I'm done ink blending on my entire panel, I take my microfiber cloth and just buff off all the ink from our stamped image. Now, to take out my panel from the sticky mat, instead of pulling the panel, I like to fold the sticky mat just so that the panel does not bend and warp. This combination of gold and teal is definitely my favorite. Well, now, as I mentioned, I wanted to keep the background as the main focus of our card today. So instead of using any focal point, I decided to make my sentiment the focal point. I decided to use the Fancy Thanks sentiment, which again is from one of previous releases by Simon Says Stamp, and this comes with the word die and the shadow die. But I'll be using only the word thanks, which is big enough to cover a portion of our background, which not only acts as a sentiment but also will be our focal point. Now, I like to stack up my sentiments just for some dimension. So here I cut the word thanks thrice using white cardstock, and I will stack one over the other using my Barely Art glue. Now, if you like adding focal points on your card, I would suggest adding some leaves or some florals or some vellum die cuts behind this thank you sentiment, and that would be absolutely perfect along with this beautiful, gorgeous background. You could also add foam tape behind these sentiments. This is big and bold enough to add thin strips of foam tape, or also add a vellum piece of the shadow for this thanks. Another way to stack up these pieces would be using some spray adhesive, which again makes your work a lot more easier. Now, once the glue on this has dried, it's now time to assemble our card together. Now, since there is dimension on the sentiment, I decided to directly adhere this panel onto a top folding A2 size note card. Again, I use my liquid glue to adhere this panel onto the note card, and then again using the liquid glue, I placed the thanks on the lower half of this panel, and using my T-square ruler, I like to make sure that this is properly aligned. Well, sorry, my head gets in the way here. Now, once I was done with the background and placement of the sentiment, I like to add some shimmer. And here I'm using my Spectrum Noir Shimmer brush pen to add some shine on this thanks sentiment. You could also use some glitter cardstock, but I didn't want to add a lot of sparkle here, so just the shimmer pen would be absolutely perfect. And here's a closer look at our finished card. I love how this card turned out. Well, I didn't add any sequins or gemstone here because the unevenly spaced dots are absolutely mimicking sequin mixes on this entire card panel. I hope you had fun watching today's video and got inspired. All the supplies that I used here will be linked down in the description box below. Note that all of these links are affiliate links, which means that if you shop using these links, I get a small commission at no cost to you guys. Check out my Instagram profile for more details on the Sweet Wishes Instagram hop. I will leave a link to that also in the description box below. Thank you again for joining me today. Until next time, stay safe.